I was 15 when my mother grabbed my arm so hard she pulled my shoulder completely out of its socket, and the sound it made will haunt me forever. Not just the wet pop of bone separating from bone, but the silence that followed. The way my father turned up the volume on the television, the way my younger brother suddenly found his homework fascinating. The way my mother looked at me with eyes that said this never happened, and if it did, it was my fault for making her angry in the first place. But before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sierra Blackwell, and I need you to understand something about pain. There's the kind that screams and demands attention, and there's the kind that whispers and begs you to pretend it doesn't exist. That Saturday afternoon in our cramped kitchen in Millbrook Falls, I learned the difference between both, and how a family can turn the loudest pain into the quietest secret. It started over laundry, such a stupid thing to destroy a shoulder over, but my mother had been drinking since breakfast, which meant everything was a potential battlefield. I'd forgotten to separate the colors from the whites, and she'd found a pink sock in with Dad's work shirts. She was standing at the kitchen counter, holding that sock like evidence of my fundamental failure as a daughter, her words getting sharper with every breath. "You're useless," she spat, her voice thick with vodka and resentment. "Absolutely useless. 16 years old and you can't even do laundry right. What good are you to anyone?" I tried to explain that I'd been studying for my chemistry test, that I'd rushed through the laundry because she'd told me to hurry. But explaining anything to my mother when she was drunk was like trying to reason with a tornado. She just got louder, meaner, more convinced that I was deliberately trying to ruin her life. "Don't you dare talk back to me," she screamed, stepping closer. I could smell the alcohol on her breath, see the rage building in her bloodshot eyes. "Don't you dare stand there and make excuses." I wasn't talking back. I was barely talking at all. But my mother had already decided I was the enemy, and when she grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my bicep like claws, I knew something terrible was about to happen. She yanked me toward her with such violent force that I felt my shoulder joint give way immediately. The pain was instant and absolute, like someone had set my entire arm on fire and then tried to tear it from my body. I screamed. I couldn't help it. The sound that came out of me was raw and desperate and completely involuntary, but it only made her angrier. She let go of my arm, and I collapsed against the refrigerator, my right arm hanging at an impossible angle, my shoulder on fire with a pain so intense I thought I might vomit. "Stop being so dramatic," she snapped, as if I'd chosen to dislocate my own shoulder for attention. "You're fine. Stop making such a scene." But I wasn't fine. I couldn't move my arm at all. Every tiny movement sent lightning bolts of agony through my entire right side. Tears were streaming down my face, and I was trying not to hyperventilate, but my mother was already walking away, dismissing my pain like it was nothing more than a tantrum. My father appeared in the doorway, took one look at me sobbing against the refrigerator with my arm hanging wrong, and his face went carefully blank. That's what my family did best. They erased things, made them disappear by refusing to acknowledge they'd ever existed. "What happened?" he asked quietly, though his tone suggested he already knew and had already decided it didn't matter. "She fell," my mother said without hesitation, not even looking at me. "She was being dramatic about the laundry, and she fell." I stared at her in shock. She was lying, right there, right in front of me, rewriting history while I was still living the truth of what she'd done. I opened my mouth to correct her, to tell my father what really happened, but the look in my mother's eyes stopped me cold. It was a look that promised worse things would happen if I dared contradict her story. "I think my shoulder is dislocated," I whispered, the words barely audible through my tears. My father glanced at my arm, winced slightly, then looked at my mother. They had some kind of silent conversation that lasted maybe 3 seconds, and then he was shaking his head. "It's probably just bruised," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Ice it. Take some ibuprofen. You'll be fine." But I wasn't fine. I spent the rest of that Saturday in my room, my arm cradled against my chest, the pain so constant and overwhelming that I couldn't think about anything else. I couldn't lift my arm, I couldn't move it away from my body. When I tried to lie down, the pain was so intense I had to sit up again. When I tried to sit up straight, everything went white around the edges. My 10-year-old brother Marcus knocked on my door around dinner time. He slipped inside without waiting for permission, took one look at me, and his eyes went wide. "Sierra, your shoulder looks weird," he said. "It's like lower than the other one." I looked down and realized he was right. My right shoulder was visibly dropped compared to my left, creating an asymmetry that was impossible to ignore once you noticed it. But when Marcus suggested we tell Dad, I shook my head quickly. "No," I said. "Mom said I fell. That's what happened. I fell." Even at 10, Marcus was smart enough to hear what I wasn't saying. He looked at me for a long moment, his face sad and older than it should have been, then nodded slowly. "Okay," he whispered. "You fell. I spent Sunday the same way, trapped in my room with pain that wasn't getting better. If anything, it was getting worse. My shoulder was swelling now, purple and angry, and I couldn't even put on a t-shirt without help. When I asked my mother if maybe we should see a doctor, she looked at me like I'd suggested burning the house down. 'For a bruise?' she laughed, but there was nothing funny about the sound. 'Don't be ridiculous. You're fine.' But I wasn't fine, and by Monday morning, even pretending I was fine had become impossible. I couldn't carry my backpack, I couldn't raise my hand in class, I couldn't even write notes because any movement of my right arm sent fresh waves of agony through my shoulder. My chemistry teacher, Mrs. Patterson, noticed immediately. "Sierra, are you all right?" she asked after class when she saw me struggling to pack up my books with just my left hand. "You seem to be favoring your right arm." I wanted to tell her. The words were right there, begging to be said. I wanted to tell her that my mother had dislocated my shoulder and then lied about it, that my father had chosen to believe the lie rather than get me help, that I'd been in agony for 3 days while everyone in my house pretended nothing had happened. Instead, I heard myself say, "I fell. It's just bruised." Mrs. Patterson frowned, clearly not convinced, but she didn't push. Teachers weren't supposed to get involved in family business, and bruises happened. Even suspicious bruises, even bruises that came with dislocated shoulders and stories that didn't quite add up. By Tuesday, I couldn't hide it anymore. I'd barely slept in 4 days because the pain was too intense to let me rest. I couldn't concentrate in class, I couldn't eat because even chewing somehow made my shoulder hurt worse. My friend Jenna cornered me at lunch, demanding to know what was wrong. "You look terrible," she said bluntly. "And why are you holding your arm like that?" I tried to deflect, to make jokes about being clumsy, but Jenna had known me since elementary school. She could see through my lies as easily as my mother could create them. "Sierra, seriously, what happened to your arm?" And for just a moment, I almost told her. I almost said the words that would make it real, that would force me to admit what my mother had done and what my family had chosen to ignore. But then I remembered my mother's eyes, the promise of worse things to come if I dared to tell the truth, and I swallowed the words like poison. "I fell down the stairs," I said. "It's just a bruise." But Jenna wasn't buying it, and neither was anyone else who looked at me closely. By Wednesday, I was walking through school like a ghost, my right arm practically useless, my shoulder screaming with every step. I'd started taking ibuprofen constantly, way more than the bottle recommended, just to take the edge off the pain. It wasn't working anymore. That's when Mrs. Patterson cornered me again, this time with backup. She'd brought the school nurse, Mrs. Rodriguez, who took one look at my shoulder and immediately knew something was seriously wrong. "Sierra, honey, I need you to show me where it hurts," Mrs. Rodriguez said gently. Her voice was kind but firm, the voice of someone who'd seen too many students try to hide serious injuries behind flimsy excuses. I tried to move my arm and couldn't stop the gasp of pain that escaped. Mrs. Rodriguez's expression darkened immediately. "How long has it been like this?" she asked. "Since Saturday," I whispered, the truth slipping out before I could stop it. "Saturday?" Mrs. Rodriguez looked horrified. "You've been in pain like this for 5 days?" I nodded, and suddenly I was crying. Not because of the pain, though that was unbearable, but because someone was finally looking at me with concern instead of indifference. Someone was finally treating my pain like it mattered. "I need to call your parents," Mrs. Rodriguez said. "You need to see a doctor immediately." Terror shot through me, sharper than the pain in my shoulder. "No, please don't call them. They'll be so angry. They said it's just a bruise. They said I'm being dramatic." Mrs.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Rodriguez and Mrs. Patterson exchanged a look that I couldn't interpret at the time, but would understand later. It was the look of adults who recognized something terrible and were trying to figure out how to help without making things worse. "Sierra," Mrs. Rodriguez said carefully, "how exactly did this injury happen?" And there it was, the question I'd been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. The chance to tell the truth or double down on the lie. I could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on me like a physical thing. "I fell," I whispered, and hated myself for it. But Mrs. Rodriguez wasn't giving up that easily. She had me fill out an incident report, documenting exactly when the injury occurred and what symptoms I'd been experiencing. She took photos of my shoulder, showing the obvious displacement and swelling. She measured the difference in height between my shoulders, documenting the asymmetry that proved this wasn't just a simple bruise. "Sierra, I'm required to send you to the hospital," she finally said. "This level of injury requires immediate medical attention, and the fact that it's been untreated for 5 days is extremely concerning." I wanted to argue, to insist I was fine, but even I couldn't maintain that lie anymore. The pain was too intense, too constant, too obviously serious for anyone to ignore. Mrs. Rodriguez called my mother, explaining that I needed immediate medical care and that she was required to transport me to the emergency room. The conversation was brief and tense. I could hear my mother's angry voice through the phone, though I couldn't make out the words. When Mrs. Rodriguez hung up, her face was grim. "Your mother will meet us at the hospital," she said. "She's not happy about being called out of work." The drive to Millbrook General Hospital was a blur of pain and anxiety. Mrs. Rodriguez kept asking gentle questions about my home life, my relationship with my parents, whether I felt safe at home. I answered everything carefully, giving her just enough truth to seem honest while protecting the bigger secret that could destroy my family. My mother was waiting in the emergency room lobby when we arrived, and the mask of concerned parent she wore was so convincing that for a moment I almost believed it myself. She hugged me carefully, avoiding my injured shoulder, and spoke to Mrs. Rodriguez in tones of grateful worry. "Thank you so much for bringing her in," she said. "I had no idea it was this serious." She said she fell down the stairs Saturday morning, but she insisted she was fine. You know how teenagers are about admitting they're hurt. Mrs. Rodriguez nodded politely, but I caught her studying my mother's face with the same intensity she'd used to examine my shoulder. She didn't believe the story any more than I did, but proving it was a different matter entirely. The triage nurse took one look at my shoulder and fast-tracked me straight to X-ray. The pain was so intense by this point that even the wheelchair ride through the hospital corridors made me dizzy. When we reached the radiology department, my mother tried to follow me into the X-ray room, but the technician stopped her. "Sorry, family has to wait outside," he said. "Radiation safety protocols." That's when I met David Chen, the X-ray technician who would change everything. He was probably in his early 30s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the sort of gentle competence that immediately put me at ease. As he positioned me for the X-rays, he noticed how carefully I was moving, how every small adjustment made me wince. "This is really hurting you, isn't it?" he said quietly. It wasn't a question. I nodded, not trusting my voice. "How long has it been like this?" he asked, his voice even quieter now. "Since Saturday," I whispered. David stopped adjusting the X-ray machine and looked at me directly. "Saturday? As in 5 days ago Saturday?" I nodded again, and I saw something shift in his expression. Something that looked like anger, but not at me. "Can you tell me what happened?" he asked gently. And maybe it was because we were alone in that sterile room, or maybe it was because David's voice held none of the judgment or disbelief I'd grown used to. but the truth came spilling out of me like water through a broken dam. "My mom grabbed my arm," I whispered. "She was angry about the laundry, and she grabbed my arm and yanked it really hard. I heard it pop. But she said I fell, and my dad believes her, and everyone keeps saying I'm being dramatic, but it hurts so much I can't even sleep." David's face went very still. He finished taking the x-rays in silence, but I could feel something different in the air. A kind of focused intensity that hadn't been there before. "Sierra," he said when we were done, "I want you to know that what you just told me matters, and I believe you." Those 5 words hit me harder than my mother's hand ever had. I believe you. When was the last time anyone had said that to me about anything that mattered? "The x-rays will show us exactly what's going on with your shoulder," David continued.
And if someone hurt you, that's going to show up too. Injuries from falls look different from injuries caused by someone grabbing and twisting. Do you understand what I'm saying? I stared at him, hardly daring to hope. You mean you'll be able to tell? I mean, the evidence is going to speak for itself, David said. And when it does, there are people whose job it is to make sure you're safe. People who will listen to what the x-rays are telling them, even if some adults don't want to hear it. David developed the x-rays immediately, and I saw his jaw tighten as he studied them. He made several phone calls in hushed tones, using words I didn't understand but that sounded official and serious. When my mother knocked on the door, demanding to know what was taking so long, David told her through the door that they were waiting for the radiologist to review the images. "Sierra," he said when we were alone again, "I've called Dr. Martinez, who's the head of orthopedics here. She's going to want to examine you personally. I've also notified our patient advocacy team, because what happened to you is something they need to know about." "What does that mean?" I asked, though part of me already knew. "It means that when injuries don't match the story we're given, especially when a child has been in pain for days without proper medical care, there are protocols we have to follow, people whose job it is to investigate and make sure it doesn't happen again." For the first time in 5 days, I felt something other than pain and fear. I felt hope, tiny and fragile, but real. Dr. Martinez arrived 20 minutes later, and she was everything David had promised. She examined my shoulder with gentle efficiency, asking detailed questions about the pain, the mechanism of injury, and the timeline of events. When she saw the x-rays, her expression grew grim. "Sierra, you have a posterior dislocation of your right shoulder," she explained. "It's been out of place for 5 days, which has allowed significant swelling and inflammation to develop. This type of injury is extremely painful and requires immediate medical intervention." She paused, studying the x-rays more closely. "The pattern of the dislocation is consistent with forced external rotation and extension. In layman's terms, this happened when someone grabbed your arm and yanked it backward with significant force. This is not an injury that typically results from a simple fall." My mother, who had been demanding entry to the room for the past hour, was finally allowed in, just as Dr. Martinez finished her explanation. She listened to the medical terminology with growing alarm, her face cycling through confusion, denial, and finally anger. "Are you saying Sierra is lying about falling?" she demanded. "Because that's exactly what happened. She fell down the stairs Saturday morning. I saw it myself." Dr. Martinez looked at my mother with the same professional calm she'd shown me, but there was steel underneath it. "Mrs. Blackwell, the injury pattern visible on these x-rays is not consistent with a fall. The mechanism of injury shows clear signs of forced manipulation of the arm, while the shoulder was in a vulnerable position." "That's impossible," my mother insisted. "Sierra fell. I don't care what your x-rays think they show." "X-rays don't think, Mrs. Blackwell. They document facts. And the facts show that your daughter has suffered a traumatic shoulder dislocation that has been left untreated for 5 days, during which time she has been experiencing severe pain and functional disability." Dr. Martinez turned to me, her voice gentler but no less serious. "Sierra, I need to ask you directly. Did someone grab your arm and cause this injury?" The room went deadly quiet.
I could feel my mother's eyes boring into me, could practically hear her thoughts screaming at me to stick to the story. But I could also feel David standing beside me, could remember his words. "I believe you." "Yes," I whispered. "My mom grabbed my arm and pulled it. I heard it pop." The explosion was immediate. My mother started shouting, calling me a liar, demanding to know why I was trying to destroy our family with false accusations. She tried to grab me again, reaching for my good arm, but David stepped between us smoothly. "Mrs. Blackwell, I need you to step back," he said firmly. "Your daughter is a patient here, and she's entitled to receive medical care without intimidation." Dr. Martinez was already moving, her hands busy with her phone. "David, please call security and get social services on the line immediately. Mrs. Blackwell, you need to understand that what you're witnessing is a mandatory reporting situation. When we have clear evidence of child abuse, we are legally required to involve the appropriate authorities." The next few hours passed in a blur of procedures and interviews. Dr. Martinez reduced my shoulder dislocation under sedation, and the relief when the joint finally slipped back into place was so intense I started crying. Not from pain this time, but from the absence of pain, from finally being able to move my arm again. Child Protective Services arrived while I was still in recovery. The caseworker, Miss Thompson, was a calm woman in her 40s who spoke to me like I was a real person instead of a problem to be solved. She documented my story carefully, took additional photographs of my shoulder, and explained what would happen next. "Sierra, based on the medical evidence and your statement, we have grounds to pursue charges of child abuse against your mother," she explained. "The fact that she denied you medical care for 5 days after causing this injury constitutes both physical abuse and medical neglect. My mother was arrested that evening. Watching her being led away in handcuffs was surreal, like something happening to someone else's family. My father arrived at the hospital in a panic, demanding to know what was happening, why his wife was being arrested over what was obviously an accident. But the evidence was overwhelming. Dr. Martinez had documented everything meticulously. David had recorded my initial statement and the timeline of the injury. The X-rays showed clear proof that this wasn't a fall. Even my father's protests seemed hollow when faced with the medical facts. I was placed in emergency foster care that night. My foster family, the Hendersons, were kind people who specialized in taking care of children in crisis situations. They had a quiet house with soft lighting and no shouting, and for the first time in 5 days, I slept through the night without pain. The legal proceedings moved quickly after that. My mother was charged with felony child abuse and child endangerment. The prosecutor explained that denying medical care to a child after causing serious injury was considered particularly egregious, as it showed conscious indifference to my suffering. My father hired a lawyer and tried to fight for custody, claiming he hadn't known how serious my injury was. But the investigation revealed that he'd seen me struggling for days, had witnessed my obvious pain and dysfunction, and had chosen to do nothing. Child Services determined that he'd failed in his duty to protect me from abuse and to ensure I received necessary medical care. The case went to trial 6 months later. David testified about finding me in the X-ray room, about my initial disclosure, and the clear evidence of prolonged untreated injury. Dr. Martinez presented the medical evidence, explaining in detail why my injury couldn't have resulted from a fall. Even Mrs. Rodriguez from school testified about my obvious distress and my family's resistance to seeking medical care. My mother's defense attorney tried to argue that the injury was accidental, that she'd grabbed my arm to steady me and hadn't meant to hurt me. But the prosecutor painted a different picture. A woman with a history of drinking problems and explosive anger who had seriously injured her child and then forced that child to suffer in silence to avoid consequences. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours, guilty on all counts. My mother was sentenced to 3 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 18 months, contingent on completing anger management and substance abuse programs. My father lost all parental rights and was ordered to pay child support while being prohibited from unsupervised contact with me. But the real healing began long before the legal system finished with my family. It started in that X-ray room with David Chen, who saw through my family's lies and refused to let me suffer in silence. It continued with Dr. Martinez, who treated my pain as real and worthy of attention.
It grew stronger with every person who believed me, who validated my experience, who refused to accept that a 15-year-old girl should just endure abuse because it was easier than confronting uncomfortable truths. Physical therapy helped restore the strength and range of motion in my shoulder, but emotional therapy helped restore something more important, my sense of my own worth. My therapist, Dr. Williams, helped me understand that what had happened to me wasn't normal, wasn't my fault, and most importantly, wasn't something I had to carry alone. The Hendersons became my permanent foster family and later my adoptive family. They were patient with my nightmares, understanding about my triggers, supportive of my determination to pursue a career in healthcare. They celebrated small victories, like the first time I raised my right hand in class without thinking about it, or the first time someone touched my shoulder and I didn't flinch. I started volunteering at the hospital during my senior year of high school, working with the patient advocacy program that had helped me. I wanted to be there for other kids who might be where I'd been, scared and hurt and convinced that no one would believe them. David Chen became a mentor and eventually a friend. He taught me that being a healthcare professional means being willing to see what others might prefer to ignore, to ask uncomfortable questions, to stand up for patients who can't stand up for themselves. He showed me that sometimes the most important medical intervention isn't a procedure or a medication, but simply believing someone when they tell you they're in pain. I'm in college now, studying to become a radiologic technologist like David. I want to be the person who looks at X-rays and sees not just broken bones, but broken trust. I want to be the voice that says, "I believe you," to kids who have been told their pain doesn't matter. My shoulder still aches sometimes, especially when it's going to rain. The ligaments never quite healed back to their original strength, and I have to be careful about certain movements. But I don't mind the reminder. It's proof that I survived something that could have destroyed me, and that I chose to let it make me stronger instead of smaller. My mother was released from prison 8 months ago. She's tried to contact me several times, through letters and phone calls and even showing up at the hospital where I volunteer. Her messages all say the same thing, that she's sorry, that she's changed, that what happened was a mistake, and I should give her another chance to be the mother I deserve. I don't respond to these attempts at contact, not because I'm cruel or unforgiving, but because I've learned the difference between accountability and manipulation. Real change would mean accepting responsibility for what she did, respecting my boundaries, and understanding that forgiveness doesn't automatically restore relationship. Her messages show none of these things. They show the same self-centeredness that led her to prioritize her own comfort over my medical needs in the first place. Instead, I focus on the family I've chosen and who chose me back. The Hendersons, who never made me feel like a burden or a charity case. David, who still checks in on me and celebrates every milestone in my education. Dr. Martinez, who wrote recommendation letters for my college applications and told me I had the heart of a healer. Marcus, my biological brother, who I still see sometimes when child services determines it's safe and appropriate.
The real victory isn't that my abuser was punished, though I'm glad she was held accountable. The real victory is that I learned to trust my own experience, to believe that my pain mattered, to understand that love should make you feel safer, not more afraid. I think about that 15-year-old girl sometimes, the one who sat in her room for 5 days with a dislocated shoulder, convinced that she had to suffer in silence because admitting the truth would make everything worse. I want to tell her that speaking up won't destroy her family because her family is already broken. I want to tell her that the pain of telling the truth is temporary, but the pain of living a lie lasts forever. Most of all, I want to tell her that she's going to meet a man named David Chen who will change everything with 5 simple words, "I believe you," and that those words will be the beginning of a new life, one where her pain is acknowledged, her truth is valued, and her healing is possible. Because that's what heroes do. They don't always wear capes or perform dramatic rescues. Sometimes they just look at an X-ray and refuse to pretend they don't see what's right in front of them. Sometimes they ask the right question at the right moment. Sometimes they simply believe a scared kid who has been told that her pain doesn't matter. David Chen saved my life in that X-ray room, not through any dramatic intervention, but by seeing me as someone worth saving. He proved that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for someone in crisis is to witness their truth and refuse to look away. My shoulder has healed, my family has been rebuilt, my future is bright with possibility. And every day, I work to be the kind of person who sees clearly, speaks truthfully, and believes without reservation that every person's pain matters, every person's story deserves to be heard, and every person has the right to be safe in their own body. That's the lesson David taught me in that quiet X-ray room all those years ago. That's the gift he gave a broken 15-year-old girl who thought she had to carry her pain alone. And that's the legacy I'm working every day to pass on to someone else who needs to hear those 5 simple, life-changing words. I believe you. The hardest part about healing wasn't the physical therapy or the court appearances or even learning to trust new people. The hardest part was accepting that I deserved to take up space in the world without apologizing for it first. Dr. Williams spent months helping me understand that my instinct to make myself smaller, quieter, less noticeable wasn't a personality trait, but a survival mechanism that no longer served me. College was where I first started to believe her. Millbrook Community College wasn't prestigious or glamorous, but it had an excellent radiologic technology program and professors who cared more about your potential than your past. When I walked into my first anatomy class and saw those familiar X-ray images projected on the screen, I felt something click into place. This was where I belonged. Professor Janet Reeves noticed my intensity immediately. While other students groaned about memorizing bone structures, I absorbed every detail like my life depended on it. Because, in a way, it did. Understanding how bodies worked, how they broke, how they healed, felt like learning a language that could have saved me years earlier. Sierra, you have an unusual perspective on medical imaging, Professor Reeves told me after class one day. Most students see bones and joints as abstract anatomical structures. You see them as stories. She was right. Every X-ray told me something about the person who had been photographed. The way bones healed spoke of time and care and proper treatment. The way they stayed broken spoke of neglect or denial or systems that had failed. I could look at a healing fracture and see love. I could look at an untreated injury and see abandonment. My clinical rotations began in my second year, and that's when I met Elena Vasquez. She was 12 years old and came into the emergency department with her grandmother, claiming she'd hurt her wrist playing soccer. But when I positioned her for the X-ray, I noticed things that made my stomach clench with recognition. Elena flinched when I touched her wrist, but not from pain. It was the flinch of someone who expected touch to hurt, even when it was gentle. Her soccer injury was to her non-dominant hand, which was unusual for sports injuries. Most significantly, her grandmother kept answering questions that were directed to Elena, and she did it with the kind of aggressive certainty I remembered from my own family. She fell during practice, the grandmother insisted before Elena could speak. These kids are always getting hurt playing rough sports. It's probably just a sprain. But the X-rays told a different story. Elena's wrist showed a classic defensive fracture, the kind that happened when someone threw their hands up to protect themselves from a blow. More concerning, there were old fractures visible in the films, healed injuries to her ribs and forearm that suggested a pattern of trauma. I stood in that dark room staring at Elena's films and felt time collapse. I was 12 years old again, sitting in my bedroom with pain I wasn't allowed to acknowledge, surrounded by adults who found it easier to pretend nothing was wrong than to face uncomfortable truths. Dr. Sarah Kim was the attending physician that day, a young woman who had just finished her pediatric emergency medicine residency. When I brought Elena's films to her, I made sure to point out everything I'd noticed, not just the acute injury, but the concerning patterns in her medical history. The fracture pattern is consistent with defensive positioning, I explained quietly, and there are multiple healed fractures visible that don't appear in her medical records. Dr. Kim studied the films carefully, then looked at me with curiosity. You have a good eye for detail, Sierra. What made you notice these things? I could have deflected, could have given some generic answer about thorough patient care. Instead, I found myself telling her the truth. I know what it looks like when injuries don't match the stories we're told, I said simply. Dr. Kim nodded slowly, understanding passing between us. Would you be willing to sit with Elena while I examine her? Sometimes patients open up more when there's someone their own age nearby. What followed was one of the most important conversations of my life, though I didn't realize it at the time. Dr. Kim sent Elena's grandmother to fill out paperwork, giving us privacy.
Then she knelt down to Elena's eye level and spoke to her with the same respect David had shown me years earlier.
Elena, your x-rays show that your wrist is broken, Dr. Kim said gently, but they also show some older injuries that we're concerned about. Can you tell us what's been happening at home? Elena's eyes darted to the door, making sure her grandmother wasn't listening. Then she looked at me, studying my face, as if trying to decide whether I could be trusted. You work here? She asked quietly. I'm learning to, I said. I take the x-ray pictures that help doctors see what's wrong. Did you see mine? I nodded. I did, and I saw that someone hurt you. Elena's face crumpled, and the words came pouring out. Her grandmother's boyfriend had been living with them for 6 months. He drank too much and had what Elena called angry days, when everything she did was wrong. Yesterday had been an angry day, and when Elena had accidentally knocked over his beer, he'd grabbed her wrist and twisted it until she heard something snap. Abuela said if I told anyone, they'd take me away and put me with strangers, Elena whispered. She said it was family business, and strangers wouldn't understand. Dr. Kim and I exchanged glances. We'd both heard those words before, in different contexts, but with the same devastating effect. Family business. The phrase that turns victims into secrets and secrets into cycles. Elena, what your grandmother's boyfriend did to you isn't family business, Dr. Kim said firmly. It's a crime. And there are people whose job it is to make sure it doesn't happen again. The next few hours unfolded with familiar precision. Child Protective Services was called. Elena's grandmother became defensive and angry, insisting this was all a misunderstanding. The boyfriend, when questioned, claimed Elena was clumsy and accident-prone. But the medical evidence was overwhelming, and Elena's testimony was clear and consistent. I stayed with Elena through the entire process, holding her good hand while she gave her statement, explaining what would happen next, reassuring her that telling the truth had been the right thing to do. When the social worker arrived to discuss placement options, Elena grabbed my arm. "Will I be okay?" she asked, her voice small and scared. I looked at this brave 12-year-old girl who had found the courage to speak her truth, and I saw myself. But I also saw possibility. I saw a future where Elena's pain would be acknowledged, where her healing would be supported, where she would learn that she deserved to be safe. "You're going to be more than okay," I told her. "You're going to be amazing." Elena was placed with a foster family that specialized in caring for children who had experienced trauma. 6 months later, she sent me a drawing she'd made in art therapy. It showed 2 stick figures in what was clearly a hospital room, one in scrubs and one with a cast, both smiling. At the bottom, she'd written, "Thank you for seeing me." That drawing is framed in my office now, next to my radiologic technology license and my college diploma. It reminds me every day why this work matters, why paying attention to the stories bones tell can literally save lives. Dr. Kim became a mentor after that, teaching me how to recognize signs of abuse in medical imaging, how to document suspicious injuries properly, how to communicate concerns to colleagues without compromising patient care. She introduced me to Dr. Rebecca Torres, who ran the hospital's child advocacy program, and I began volunteering there during my final year of school. The Advocacy Center was where I learned that my experience with David wasn't unique. Every week, we saw children whose injuries told stories their families didn't want heard. Broken bones that came from falls that defied physics. Burns with patterns that suggested intentional infliction. Head injuries in babies whose parents claimed they'd rolled off the bed. My job was to review medical imaging and flag cases that warranted further investigation. It was devastating work, but also essential. Every case we identified meant another child who might be protected, another family that might be held accountable, another cycle that might be broken. I graduated summa cum laude and was immediately offered a position in the radiology department at Millbrook General, working alongside David. It felt like coming full circle, returning to the place where my real life had begun with 5 simple words: I believe you. David had become the senior technologist by then, responsible for training new staff and overseeing the department's quality assurance programs. Working with him was like having a masterclass in compassionate healthcare every day. He taught me technical skills, but more importantly, he modeled what it looked like to see patients as whole human beings, rather than just collections of symptoms. The machine takes the pictures, he told me during my first week, but we see the people. Never forget that distinction. My first solo case as a certified technologist was an 8-year-old boy named Marcus, whose name hit me like a physical blow because it was the same as my brother's. This Marcus came in with his father, reporting that he'd fallen off his bike and hurt his arm. But something about their interaction felt off to me. The father was too insistent about the story, repeating details that hadn't been asked for. Marcus was too quiet, too compliant, too careful about making eye contact. When I positioned him for the X-ray, I noticed finger-shaped bruises on his upper arm, partially hidden by his shirt sleeve. The X-rays showed a spiral fracture of the humerus, a break pattern that typically resulted from twisting force rather than impact trauma. It was the kind of injury that happened when someone grabbed a child's arm and twisted it, not when someone fell off a bicycle.
I felt my heart rate spike as I processed the films. This was it. This was my test. Would I have the courage to speak up for this child the way David had spoken up for me? I called Dr. Martinez, who was still the chief of orthopedics, and explained what I'd found. She reviewed the images immediately and agreed with my assessment. Within an hour, Marcus's father was being questioned by hospital security, while Marcus was being gently interviewed by a trained social worker. The truth came out quickly. Marcus's father had been struggling with unemployment and stress, and his frustration had been escalating into physical abuse. The bike story was fabricated to explain away an injury that had happened when the father grabbed Marcus's arm in anger and twisted it hard enough to break the bone. As I watched Marcus being comforted by the social worker, I felt something shift inside me. This was why I'd survived my own trauma. This was the purpose that had grown from my pain. I was the person who could look at X-rays and see the truth, who could speak up for children who couldn't speak for themselves. But the job wasn't always about dramatic rescues or clear-cut cases of abuse. Sometimes it was about smaller acts of advocacy, about treating each patient with dignity and respect, about creating an environment where people felt safe enough to tell the truth about their lives. Like Mrs. Rose Chen, an elderly woman who came in with multiple falls over the course of several months. Her adult son always accompanied her to appointments, always had explanations for her injuries, always spoke for her when doctors asked questions. But I noticed that Mrs. Chen seemed afraid of her son, that she flinched when he raised his voice, that her falls always seemed to happen when she was alone with him. Elder abuse is often invisible in healthcare settings because family members are assumed to be caregivers rather than potential threats. But X-rays don't lie about injury patterns, and Mrs. Chen's films showed classic signs of physical abuse. Defensive fractures, healing injuries in various stages, trauma patterns inconsistent with simple falls. I brought my concerns to Dr. Kim, who had joined our staff as an attending physician. Together, we developed a plan to create opportunities for Mrs. Chen to speak privately with healthcare providers, away from her son's controlling presence. It took 3 months and multiple appointments, but eventually, Mrs. Chen found the courage to disclose that her son had been physically abusing her and financially exploiting her for years. The intervention that followed was complex and challenging. Elder abuse cases often involve complicated family dynamics, financial entanglements, and systemic issues that make simple solutions impossible. But Mrs. Chen was eventually placed in a safe living situation. Her son was prosecuted for abuse and financial exploitation, and she began the slow process of rebuilding her life at 73 years old. "Thank you for seeing me," she told me at her final follow-up appointment, her words echoing Elena's note from years earlier. That phrase became a common thread in my work. Patients who felt invisible in their own families suddenly felt seen in our radiology department. Children who had been told their pain didn't matter found adults who took their injuries seriously. Elderly patients who had been dismissed as confused or difficult discovered healthcare providers who listened to their concerns with respect and attention.
David and I developed training protocols for the entire hospital staff on recognizing signs of abuse in medical imaging. We created documentation standards that would stand up in court, communication guidelines that protected patient confidentiality while ensuring appropriate reporting, and support systems for healthcare workers who might be triggered by cases that reminded them of their own experiences. The work was emotionally demanding, but it was also deeply fulfilling. Every case we handled appropriately meant someone's suffering was acknowledged, someone's truth was believed, someone's safety was prioritized. We were building a healthcare system that saw patients as whole human beings worthy of protection and care. But the most challenging aspect of my work wasn't the difficult cases or the emotional intensity of trauma recognition. It was dealing with my own family's attempts to reconnect with me as I became more successful and visible in my career. My mother had been released from prison after serving 18 months of her 3-year sentence. She'd completed anger management classes and substance abuse treatment, and according to her letters, she was a changed person who deeply regretted what had happened and wanted nothing more than to rebuild our relationship. Her first letter arrived on my graduation day, delivered to the Henderson family's house where I still lived while saving money for my own apartment. The timing felt intentional, as if she'd been watching my life from a distance and wanted to insert herself into moments of achievement and celebration. The letter was full of apologies and explanations, promises about how different things would be now, assertions that she'd learned from her mistakes and grown as a person. She talked about the therapy she'd received in prison, the insights she'd gained about her own childhood trauma, the ways she now understood how alcohol had affected her judgment and behavior. Reading it felt like being transported back to my childhood, when my mother's apologies after violent episodes were always elaborate productions designed to make me feel guilty for being hurt in the first place. The language was different now, more sophisticated and psychologically informed, but the underlying message was the same. Her pain was more important than mine, her healing was more urgent than my safety, and I should prioritize her emotional needs over my own well-being. I didn't respond to the first letter or the second or the third, but my mother was persistent, and her messages became increasingly manipulative as my silence continued. She started mentioning Marcus, my younger brother, claiming that he missed me and wanted to see me but was too afraid to reach out directly. She talked about family holidays I was missing, celebrations that felt empty without me, the deep sadness that pervaded their house because of my absence. The letters escalated to phone calls to my workplace, emails to my personal accounts, and eventually showing up at the hospital where I worked. David handled the first incident, firmly but politely explaining that personal visits during work hours weren't appropriate, and directing my mother to leave the premises. But she returned several times, becoming more aggressive and demanding with each visit. The situation came to a head on a Tuesday morning when I was working with a young patient who had been in a car accident. My mother somehow made it past hospital security and entered the radiology department while I was positioning the child for x-rays. She started talking loudly about forgiveness and family reconciliation, creating a scene that was traumatic for the injured child and his parents. That's when I realized that my mother's healing was just another form of manipulation. A truly changed person would have respected my boundaries, understood that healing takes time, recognized that her needs didn't override my right to feel safe. Instead, she was using the language of recovery and therapy as tools to pressure me into giving her what she wanted, access to me and absolution for what she'd done. I filed for a restraining order that afternoon. The legal process was simpler than I'd expected because there was already substantial documentation of her history of violence and my family's failure to protect me. The order prohibited her from contacting me directly or indirectly, from coming to my workplace or home, from attempting to communicate through third parties. My father called that evening, angry and defensive, demanding to know why I was dragging up the past when my mother was trying to make amends. The conversation was brief because I'd learned to recognize manipulation tactics and refused to engage with them. Dad, she dislocated my shoulder and then forced me to suffer in silence for 5 days. She was convicted of child abuse in a court of law. The past isn't something I'm dragging up, it's something that happened to me. And her wanting forgiveness doesn't mean I'm obligated to provide it.
He tried to argue, to minimize what had happened, to frame my boundaries as vindictive and unreasonable. But I'd heard all these arguments before, had processed them thoroughly in therapy, and had learned to distinguish between genuine accountability and performative remorse. I hope she continues to work on herself and finds peace, I told him. But that work has to happen without me.
My job isn't to help her feel better about what she did. My job is to protect myself and build a life where I feel safe. I hung up after that and never spoke to him again. The decision wasn't made in anger or spite, but from a clear understanding of what healthy relationships required. People who truly love you don't demand access to you as proof of their importance. They don't use guilt and manipulation to override your boundaries. They don't prioritize their own comfort over your well-being. The Hendersons had shown me what real family looked like. When I told them about the restraining order, they didn't try to talk me out of it or suggest I give my biological family another chance. They listened to my reasoning, supported my decision, and offered practical help with the legal process. Family isn't defined by DNA, Patricia Henderson told me that night. It's defined by love, respect, and commitment to each other's well-being. You deserve relationships that make you feel safer, not more afraid. Marcus, my biological brother, had turned 18 by then and was legally able to contact me directly if he chose to. I left that door open, making it clear through mutual acquaintances that I would be happy to hear from him, but wouldn't pressure him to choose sides in our family's dysfunction. He reached out 6 months later, asking if we could meet for coffee. The young man who sat across from me at the downtown cafe was barely recognizable as the scared 10-year-old who had whispered, "You fell," in my bedroom doorway. He was tall now, serious, carrying himself with the careful composure of someone who had learned to navigate dangerous emotional terrain. "I remember that day," he said without preamble. "I remember your shoulder looking wrong and you being in so much pain. I remember Mom telling everyone you fell, and I remember knowing it wasn't true." We talked for 3 hours that day, sharing memories and perspectives, filling in gaps in each other's understanding of our childhood. Marcus told me about the years after I'd left, how our parents had worked hard to rewrite the family narrative, painting me as mentally unstable and vindictive, someone who had destroyed their family with false accusations. "But I knew what I'd seen," Marcus said. "And when I got older and started understanding legal procedures, I looked up your case. I read the court documents, the medical reports, the testimony. Everything you said was true, and everything they said was lies." Marcus had moved out the day he turned 18, using money he'd saved from part-time jobs to rent a small apartment across town. He was working full-time and taking community college classes, building a life that didn't include the chaos and manipulation that had defined our childhood home. "I don't want a relationship with them," he told me. "I've seen how they treat people they claim to love. I don't trust them to change, and I don't want to spend my life waiting for them to hurt me the way they hurt you." We began building a relationship slowly, carefully, both of us hyper-aware of the patterns we'd learned in our original family and determined not to repeat them. We met regularly for coffee or meals, sharing updates about our lives, supporting each other through challenges, celebrating achievements together. Marcus was studying business administration with plans to become a financial advisor. His goal was to help people protect their assets and plan for their futures. Skills he'd learned were crucial after watching our parents' financial instability and poor decision-making throughout our childhood. "I want to help people build security," he explained. "I never want anyone to feel as vulnerable as we did growing up." Having Marcus back in my life felt like recovering a piece of myself I'd thought was lost forever. He was the only person who truly understood the specific dynamics of our family, the only witness to the smaller daily cruelties that never made it into court documents but had shaped both of our worldviews. More importantly, our relationship became proof that healing was possible, that cycles could be broken, that people could choose to build something better from the wreckage of their origins. We were both products of the same dysfunctional family, but we'd both found ways to create lives defined by safety, respect, and genuine care for others. As my career progressed and my personal life stabilized, I began speaking publicly about my experience. Not because I wanted attention or sympathy, but because I'd learned how powerful it could be for trauma survivors to hear from someone who had walked a similar path and emerged stronger on the other side. My first speaking engagement was at a conference for healthcare professionals focused on trauma-informed care.
I talked about the importance of believing patients when their stories didn't match their family's explanations, about recognizing signs of abuse in medical imaging, about creating environments where people felt safe enough to disclose traumatic experiences. The response was overwhelming. Healthcare workers approached me afterward with their own stories of patients they'd suspected were being abused but hadn't known how to help. They shared cases where their instincts had told them something was wrong, but they'd been overruled by colleagues who didn't want to get involved in family business. Most powerfully, several conference attendees disclosed their own experiences of childhood abuse and the healthcare providers who had either helped or failed them. They talked about the lasting impact of being believed versus being dismissed, about how medical professionals had either opened doors to safety or reinforced messages that their pain didn't matter. Those conversations led to more speaking opportunities, consulting work with hospitals developing abuse recognition protocols, and eventually a position on the state medical board's Committee on Child Protection in Healthcare Settings. I was becoming not just someone who had survived trauma, but someone who was actively working to prevent it from happening to others. The work was emotionally challenging, but deeply meaningful. Every policy we developed, every training program we implemented, every protocol we established represented potential lives saved, potential futures protected, potential cycles broken. David often joked that I'd become the person he'd always known I could be, but I knew the truth was more complex. I'd become the person I'd needed when I was 15 and scared and convinced that my pain didn't matter. I was the adult who would have looked at my x-rays and asked the right questions, who would have believed my answers, who would have taken action to ensure my safety. But perhaps more importantly, I'd learned to be that person for myself as well, to trust my own perceptions, to value my own well-being, to build relationships that honored my worth rather than questioning it. The scared 15-year-old who had thought she deserved to suffer in silence had grown into a woman who knew she deserved to take up space in the world, to speak her truth, to demand that others treat her with respect and care. That transformation hadn't happened overnight or without setbacks. There were still days when I heard my mother's voice in my head, telling me I was too sensitive, too dramatic, too much trouble. There were still moments when I had to consciously choose to believe my own experiences rather than the gaslighting messages that had been embedded in my psyche for so many years. But those moments became fewer and farther between as I continued to build a life surrounded by people who saw my sensitivity as strength, my advocacy as necessary, my existence as valuable. The Hendersons, David, Dr. Kim, Marcus, my colleagues at the hospital, the patients whose lives I'd been privileged to touch, they all reflected back to me a version of myself that was worthy of love and protection and care. And slowly, gradually, I began to believe them. 5 years into my career as a radiologic technologist, I was offered the position of department supervisor at Millbrook General. It felt surreal to be sitting in the same office where administrators had once discussed my case as a minor, now as a respected member of the medical team being entrusted with leadership responsibilities. David was retiring, and hospital administration wanted someone who understood both the technical aspects of medical imaging and the human elements of patient care. My reputation for identifying cases of abuse had spread beyond our facility, and I'd become the person other hospitals called when they needed guidance on suspicious injury patterns or documentation protocols. The promotion came with new challenges and responsibilities that extended far beyond taking x-rays.
I was now responsible for staff training, quality assurance, budget management, and serving as a liaison between the radiology department and other hospital services. But the aspect of the job I found most meaningful was developing comprehensive abuse recognition training for all hospital staff. Working with Dr. Torres from the Child Advocacy Center, we created simulation exercises that taught healthcare workers how to recognize concerning injury patterns, how to document suspicious findings appropriately, and how to communicate with patients who might be experiencing trauma. The training wasn't just about medical knowledge. It was about creating a culture where every staff member understood their role in protecting vulnerable patients. During one of these training sessions, I met Dr. James Liu, a pediatric surgeon who had recently joined our staff after completing his fellowship at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. He was participating in our abuse recognition training not because it was required, but because he'd specifically requested to attend after hearing about our program's reputation. Dr. Liu had grown up in an abusive household himself, though his trauma had been more psychological than physical. His parents had been demanding perfectionists who used emotional manipulation and withholding of affection to control his behavior. While he'd never been physically injured, he understood the lasting impact of childhood trauma and was passionate about creating healthcare environments where all forms of abuse could be recognized and addressed. Most people think of abuse in terms of obvious physical injuries, he said during our first conversation, but emotional abuse, medical neglect, financial exploitation, they all leave marks too. They're just harder to see on an X-ray. James brought a perspective to our program that I hadn't fully considered before. While I'd become expert at recognizing physical signs of trauma, he helped me understand the more subtle presentations of abuse that might not show up in medical imaging, but were equally damaging to patients' well-being. We began collaborating on research projects that examined the intersection of medical care and trauma recognition. Our first published paper analyzed 5 years of emergency department data, correlating suspicious injury patterns with successful interventions by Child Protective Services. The research showed that hospitals with comprehensive abuse recognition training had significantly higher rates of appropriate reporting and successful prosecutions. Working closely with James on these projects, I found myself drawn to his quiet intensity and genuine compassion for vulnerable populations. He approached every case with meticulous attention to detail and unwavering commitment to patient advocacy, qualities that reminded me of David while being uniquely his own. Our professional relationship gradually evolved into a personal one, built on shared values and mutual respect rather than dramatic romance. We both understood that healing from trauma was ongoing work, not a destination you reached and then forgot about. We both knew that healthy relationships required conscious effort, clear communication, and absolute commitment to each other's well-being. James proposed 2 years later in the hospital courtyard where we'd had our first conversation outside of work. It wasn't a grand gesture or surprise event, but a quiet moment between two people who had found in each other the safety and understanding they'd both been seeking their entire lives. "I want to build something beautiful with you," he said simply, "something that honors where we've been while creating space for where we're going." Our wedding was small and intimate, held in the Henderson family's backyard, with only the people who truly mattered to us in attendance. Marcus walked me down the aisle, David served as James's best man, and Patricia Henderson cried happy tears as she watched me marry someone who saw my strength rather than my damage. We bought a house 6 months later, a modest colonial with large windows and an open floor plan that felt nothing like the cramped, tense spaces where we'd both grown up. We painted the walls in warm colors, filled the rooms with plants and books and comfortable furniture, created a home that felt safe and welcoming and peaceful. Marcus was a frequent visitor, often bringing his girlfriend Rebecca, a social worker who specialized in helping aging adults navigate complex family dynamics. The four of us would spend weekend evenings cooking elaborate meals together, playing board games, sharing stories about our work and dreams for the future. It was the family dinner experience none of us had ever had growing up, complete with laughter and genuine interest in each other's lives. My mother made one final attempt to contact me during this period, sending a letter through Marcus rather than violating the restraining order directly. The letter was different from her previous communications, less manipulative and more genuinely reflective. She wrote about the therapy work she'd continued after her release from prison, her recognition of the lasting damage she'd caused, her understanding that I had every right to keep her out of my life permanently. "I don't expect forgiveness," she wrote. "I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that I understand now what I took from you, and I'm sorry in ways that words can't express. I hope you found peace and happiness. I hope you've built a life filled with people who appreciate how extraordinary you are." Reading the letter, I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness exactly, but a kind of closure I hadn't realized I was seeking. My mother's acknowledgement of the harm she'd caused didn't erase the trauma or justify what had happened, but it did validate my experience in a way that felt meaningful. I didn't respond to the letter, but I kept it, not as a door to future contact, but as evidence that accountability was possible, that people could genuinely recognize the impact of their actions, even when it was too late to repair the damage. It gave me hope for the parents I worked with through the hospital's intervention programs, proof that sometimes people could face hard truths about themselves and choose to do better. James and I decided not to have biological children, a choice that surprised some people but felt absolutely right to both of us.
We'd both seen too much of what could happen when people became parents without doing the work to heal their own trauma first. Instead, we chose to pour our energy into the children who came through our professional lives, the patients who needed advocates, and the families who needed support navigating complex medical situations. We became foster parents when I was 32, specifically requesting placement of teenagers who were aging out of the system with limited family support. Our first placement was 16-year-old Destiny, a young woman who had been in care since age 12 and was convinced that all adults were fundamentally untrustworthy. Destiny had been physically abused by her stepfather and emotionally neglected by her mother, experiences that had left her angry, defensive, and absolutely determined never to depend on anything for anything. She tested our boundaries constantly during her first months with us, waiting for us to prove that we were just like every other adult who had failed her. "You'll get tired of me eventually," she told me one evening after a particularly challenging day. "Everyone does. I'm too much work for what I'm worth." Hearing those words was like looking into a mirror that showed my 15-year-old self. The pain behind Destiny's anger was achingly familiar, as was her conviction that she was fundamentally unworthy of consistent love and care. "Destiny, you are not too much work," I told her firmly. "You are a person who has been hurt by adults who were supposed to protect you. Your anger makes perfect sense. Your wariness makes perfect sense. And none of that changes the fact that you deserve to be safe and cared for." It took almost a year for Destiny to begin trusting that James and I meant what we said. The breakthrough came when she developed pneumonia and needed to be hospitalized for several days. She was terrified that we would abandon her while she was sick, convinced that illness would reveal how burdensome she really was. Instead, we took turns staying with her around the clock, advocating with medical staff when her pain wasn't being adequately managed, ensuring she had books and music and comfortable clothes from home. When she was discharged, James had rearranged his surgical schedule to be home during her recovery, and I had coordinated with her teachers to bring her assignments to the house so she wouldn't fall behind in school. "You stayed," she whispered on her first day back home, as if she couldn't quite believe it. "Of course we stayed," I said. "We're your family now. Families show up for each other, especially when things are hard." Destiny lived with us for 2 years until she graduated high school and left for college on a full academic scholarship.
She studied psychology with plans to become a therapist specializing in adolescent trauma, determined to be the kind of adult she'd needed during her own difficult years. The night before she left for college, she gave me a card she'd made herself. Inside, she'd written, "Thank you for teaching me that I deserve to take up space in the world. Thank you for showing me what love looks like when it's real." After Destiny, we fostered 3 more teenagers over the course of 5 years. Each placement brought unique challenges and rewards, but the common thread was always the same: young people who had been taught that they were worthless, discovering that they were precious; children who had been silenced, learning that their voices mattered; adolescents who had been abandoned, learning that some adults could be trusted to stay. My work at the hospital continued to evolve as well. I was promoted to Director of Radiology Services, overseeing multiple departments and serving on the hospital's executive committee. The abuse recognition protocols we'd developed became a model that was adopted by hospitals throughout the state, and I was frequently invited to speak at medical conferences about trauma-informed imaging practices. But the case that defined my career happened 7 years into my marriage to James. A 4-year-old girl named Olivia was brought to our emergency department by her father, who claimed she'd fallen down a flight of stairs while playing. The mechanism of injury he described should have resulted in specific types of trauma, but Olivia's X-rays showed something completely different. She had multiple fractures in various stages of healing, indicating a pattern of ongoing abuse rather than a single incident. More concerning, she had internal injuries that suggested blunt force trauma to her abdomen, injuries that could have been fatal if left untreated much longer. When I reviewed Olivia's films, I felt the familiar combination of professional determination and personal fury that came with recognizing serious child abuse. This wasn't just medical neglect or a single incident of violence. This was systematic torture of a preschooler who was too young to even understand why she was being hurt. I called Dr. Kim immediately, knowing that Olivia needed both urgent medical care and immediate protection from whoever had been abusing her. The interdisciplinary team assembled quickly: pediatric surgery, child protective services, law enforcement, and hospital administration, all working together to ensure Olivia's safety while gathering evidence for criminal prosecution.
Olivia's father was arrested that afternoon. The investigation revealed that he'd been physically abusing her for more than a year, escalating in severity as his drug addiction worsened. Olivia's mother worked multiple jobs to support the family and had been unaware of the extent of the abuse, though she later admitted to seeing concerning bruises that her husband had explained away as normal childhood injuries. Olivia required multiple surgeries to repair the internal damage caused by her father's violence. James was the lead surgeon on her case, and I coordinated with the surgical team to ensure that her medical imaging was documented in ways that would support the criminal prosecution. It was emotionally devastating work, but also critically important. During Olivia's recovery, her mother made the difficult decision to divorce her abusive husband and commit fully to protecting her daughter. She attended parenting classes, substance abuse counseling for families affected by addiction, and trauma therapy to help her process her own experiences of domestic violence. "I didn't know," she told me one afternoon while Olivia was sleeping in her hospital bed. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't want to believe it could be that bad. I was working so much, trying to keep us afloat financially, and I told myself that the bruises were just from normal kid stuff. I understood her guilt and self-recrimination because I'd seen it in so many families affected by abuse. The non-abusive parent often carried tremendous shame about not recognizing the signs sooner, not protecting their child more effectively, not preventing the trauma from occurring. "The person responsible for hurting Olivia is her father," I told her gently. "You were trying to survive in an impossible situation. What matters now is that you're making choices to protect her going forward." Olivia's father was ultimately sentenced to 15 years in prison for aggravated child abuse. The medical evidence was overwhelming, and my testimony about the injury patterns helped the jury understand the systematic nature of the abuse. It was one of the most satisfying professional moments of my career, knowing that justice had been served and that Olivia would grow up safe from the person who had hurt her. But the case also highlighted something I'd been thinking about for years: the need for more comprehensive support systems for families affected by trauma. Prosecuting abusers was important, but it wasn't enough if we weren't also helping survivors heal and building communities that could recognize and prevent abuse before it escalated to life-threatening levels. That realization led to my next career transition. After 10 years in hospital leadership, I decided to pursue a master's degree in public health with a focus on injury prevention and community intervention programs. James was incredibly supportive of the decision, even though it meant 2 years of me being in school part-time while maintaining my hospital responsibilities. My graduate research focused on developing community-based abuse prevention programs that could identify at-risk families and provide support before trauma occurred. The traditional model of waiting for abuse to happen and then responding to it seemed fundamentally flawed to me. Why not create systems that addressed the root causes of family violence: poverty, social isolation, untreated mental health issues, substance abuse, lack of parenting skills, intergenerational trauma? Working with Dr. Torres and a team of social workers, psychologists, and public health experts, we developed a pilot program called Family Foundations that provided comprehensive support to families during high-stress periods: job loss, divorce, new baby, serious illness, housing instability. The program included counseling services, parenting education, financial assistance, childcare support, and regular home visits by trained family advocates. The results were remarkable. Families enrolled in Family Foundations showed significantly lower rates of Child Protective Services involvement, emergency department visits for suspicious injuries, and reports of domestic violence. More importantly, parents reported feeling more confident in their caregiving abilities, more connected to community resources, and better equipped to handle stress without taking it out on their children. The program was so successful that it received state funding to expand to 3 additional counties. I was offered the position of program director, which meant leaving my hospital career to focus full-time on community-based prevention work. It was a difficult decision because I loved medical imaging and felt deeply connected to the hospital where my own healing had begun. David, now enjoying retirement but still volunteering occasionally in the radiology department, helped me think through the choice. "Sierra, you've already proven that you can excel in hospital-based care," he said during one of our regular coffee meetings. "The question is whether you're ready to take everything you've learned and apply it on a larger scale." He was right. After 15 years of identifying abuse after it had already occurred, I was ready to focus on preventing it from happening in the first place. I accepted the position as Director of Family Foundations and transitioned out of my hospital role, though I maintained consulting relationships with several medical centers and continued to provide expert testimony in criminal cases when needed. The community prevention work was different from anything I'd done before, but it drew on all the skills I'd developed throughout my career. Understanding trauma helped me design programs that were sensitive to the experiences of parents who had been abused as children. My medical background helped me recognize when families needed clinical intervention in addition to social support. My personal experience of healing helped me maintain hope even when working with families facing seemingly insurmountable challenges. One of our most successful families was Maria Santos, a single mother of 3 who was referred to our program after her ex-husband was arrested for domestic violence. Maria was struggling with depression, financial stress, and the challenge of parenting 3 young children while dealing with her own trauma from years of abuse. When our family advocate first visited Maria's home, she found a woman who was overwhelmed and isolated, convinced that she was failing her children and that they would be better off without her. Maria had grown up in an abusive household herself and had no models for healthy parenting or stress management. Over the course of 18 months, our team worked with Maria to address multiple aspects of her situation. She received individual therapy to process her trauma, parenting education to learn effective discipline strategies, financial counseling to improve her economic stability, and regular childcare support so she could attend appointments and have occasional breaks from caregiving responsibilities. The transformation was gradual but profound. Maria learned to recognize her own triggers and develop healthy coping strategies when she felt overwhelmed. She connected with other single mothers through our support groups and built a network of friendships that provided both practical help and emotional support. Most importantly, she began to see herself as a capable parent who deserved respect and assistance rather than judgment and criticism. I used to think that asking for help meant I was weak, Maria told me during our program evaluation interview. Now I understand that asking for help means I'm strong enough to put my children's needs first.
Maria's children flourished as their mother's mental health improved and their home environment became more stable. The oldest child, who had been having behavioral problems at school, began excelling academically once the chaos at home decreased. The middle child, who had been extremely withdrawn and anxious, started participating in school activities and making friends. The youngest, who had been delayed in his speech development, caught up to his peers once he was living in an environment with less stress and more consistent nurturing. Stories like Maria's reinforced my belief that most parents want to do right by their children, but often lack the support and resources they need to succeed. Rather than waiting for families to fail and then punishing them for that failure, we could intervene early with compassion and practical assistance to help them thrive. The Family Foundations program continued to grow and evolve over my 5 years as director. We added components for teen parents, grandparents raising grandchildren, families affected by substance abuse, and military families dealing with deployment stress. Each specialization required different approaches and resources, but the core principle remained the same. Supporting families before crisis occurred was more effective and more humane than responding to trauma after the fact. As the program's reputation spread, I was invited to consult with other communities interested in developing similar initiatives. I traveled throughout the region, training local organizations on trauma-informed community intervention and helping them adapt our model to their specific populations and resources. This work led to my appointment to the Governor's Task Force on Child Abuse Prevention, where I helped develop statewide policies for supporting at-risk families. It was surreal to sit in the state capitol, helping to shape legislation that could protect thousands of children, remembering the scared 15-year-old I had once been who thought no one would ever believe her story. During one particularly meaningful task force meeting, we were reviewing proposed legislation that would require all healthcare providers to receive training in abuse recognition and trauma-informed care. As I listened to senators and representatives debate the importance of this training, I thought about David and the moment he had chosen to believe me despite my family's lies. This legislation isn't just about identifying abuse after it happens, I told the committee. It's about creating a healthcare system where every patient feels safe enough to tell the truth about their lives. When we train providers to recognize trauma and respond with compassion, we create opportunities for early intervention that can prevent years of suffering. The legislation passed unanimously and was signed into law 6 months later.
As I watched the governor sign the bill, surrounded by advocates and survivors who had worked tirelessly to make this moment possible, I felt a profound sense of completion. The scared, hurt child I had once been was now helping to ensure that other children would have advocates and protectors who were trained to recognize their pain and take action to help them. My marriage to James continued to be a source of strength and joy throughout this period of professional growth. We supported each other through challenging cases, celebrated victories together, and maintained the conscious communication practices that kept our relationship healthy despite the emotional demands of our work. We fostered 2 more teenagers during my time with Family Foundations. Kevin, a 17-year-old who had aged out of multiple placements due to his anger management issues, and Sophia, a 15-year-old who had been trafficked and was working to rebuild her sense of safety and autonomy. Both placements tested our skills as foster parents and reminded us that love alone wasn't enough to heal trauma. Kevin required intensive therapy and medication management for his mental health issues, while Sophia needed specialized care for survivors of trafficking. But both young people taught us about resilience and the human capacity for healing when provided with consistent support and genuine care. Kevin is now a mechanic with his own small business, married to a wonderful woman who understands his history and supports his continued growth. Sophia graduated high school early and is studying criminal justice with plans to work with law enforcement on trafficking prevention. Both stay in touch with us regularly, and both consider us family in the truest sense of the word. On my 40th birthday, James surprised me with a celebration that included everyone who had been important to my journey. The Hendersons, now in their 70s but still energetic and loving, Marcus and Rebecca, recently engaged and planning their own wedding, David, proudly sharing stories about his former students' accomplishments, Dr. Kim, Dr. Martinez, Dr. Torres, and colleagues from both the hospital and Family Foundations. But the surprise that moved me most was a video message from Destiny, now Dr. Destiny Williams, who had just completed her doctoral degree in clinical psychology. In the video, she talked about how living with James and me had changed her understanding of what family could be, how our stability and support had given her the foundation she needed to pursue her dreams. Sierra taught me that surviving trauma doesn't mean you're broken, Destiny said in the video. It means you're strong enough to help other people heal too. Everything I've accomplished is built on the love and belief you gave me when I couldn't believe in myself. Similar messages came from other young people we'd fostered, families we'd worked with through Family Foundations, and colleagues whose lives had been touched by our advocacy work. Seeing the ripple effects of choosing to speak up, to believe others, to use my experience to protect vulnerable people felt like the greatest gift I could have received. As I stood in our backyard that evening, surrounded by chosen family and celebrating 4 decades of life that had been marked by both tremendous pain and extraordinary healing, I thought about the X-ray room where everything had changed. David's 5 simple words, "I believe you," had set in motion a chain of events that had transformed not just my life, but the lives of countless others. That scared 15-year-old with the dislocated shoulder could never have imagined the woman she would become. Confident, accomplished, surrounded by love, using her voice to protect others who couldn't yet protect themselves. The journey from difdom to survivor to advocate hadn't been linear or easy, but it had been profoundly meaningful. I thought about all the children who would grow up safer because healthcare providers had been trained to recognize abuse. All the families who would stay together because they'd received support before reaching a crisis point. All the young people who would age out of foster care with skills and connections and hope because someone had chosen to invest in their potential. Most importantly, I thought about the truth that David had helped me discover in that radiology room all those years ago. Every person's pain matters, every person's story deserves to be heard, and every person has the right to be safe in their own body. These weren't just ideals to aspire to. They were principles I'd spent my career implementing, one patient and one family at a time. The work continues. There will always be more children who need advocates, more families who need support, more communities that need healing. But I face that work now with confidence and joy, knowing that transformation is possible, that cycles can be broken, that love really can triumph over trauma when it's backed up by action and accountability. My shoulder still aches sometimes when storms are coming, a permanent reminder of where this journey began. But I've learned to think of that ache not as a sign of damage, but as a symbol of survival. It reminds me that I am a person who refused to stay silent about abuse, who chose healing over hatred, who turned her pain into power and her trauma into triumph. That's the story I want people to remember. Not just that abuse happens, but that healing is possible. Not just that children can be hurt, but that they can also be protected. Not just that families can be broken, but that they can also be rebuilt with intention and love and commitment to doing better. Every day, I wake up grateful for the people who chose to believe me when I finally found the courage to speak my truth. And every day, I work to be that person, for someone else who needs to know that their pain matters, their story matters, and they deserve to be safe. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.